in today's video. I talked to Aimee Laming. Aimee is a highly specialist speech and language therapist who currently works at a school supporting those who are autistic and have other conditions. Aimee has been working with children and young teens who are autistic for over 20 years, as well as seeing children with a range of speech and language needs. I speak to Aimee about her experience over the years, what she thinks needs to improve, and what exactly does a speech and language therapist does, and what made her pursue that career. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of MaxiAspie and the Autism Connections, and today my guest is Aimee Laming, who is a speech and language therapist.
Hi there, hi Max, nice to come and talk to you today.
No, absolutely, thank you for coming on and you know, agreeing to talk about your experience and all things autism and neurodiverse.
Brilliant.
The first question I always ask people when they come on is, what is your connection to autism?
So I'm a speech and language therapist. I've been a speech and language therapist for 22 years now. I started off working in community clinics, so I came across children with autism who were between 0 and 5, and then I've been part of a multidisciplinary team, so we'd be the first person that would come along and we'd do the assessment, which was over 3 days. And actually that journey was really interesting for me as a newly qualified therapist, because you'd have some parents who'd be like knocking down the door saying, my child has autism, please help us. They'd really wanted a diagnosis, and actually they'd kind of read up about it. They knew they were already all the way down the journey and just needed someone to kind of cross the finish line. Cross the finish line, the dots and lines anyway. And then you'd have other parents who would come along who may not have heard of autism, didn't know, or the children might be presenting more subtly. And actually that would be a completely different assessment process for them, because it would be about, they might be their first child, they might not have seen some of the signs and symptoms. But really it was, I think for me, working in assessment is that I think it's really empowering, and I know that you find it empowering, that once you kind of understand autism, and the other thing that I really love is that we're developing our understanding of autism all the time. Every day something's coming up, there are new developments, there are new ways we're thinking about autism. And I think that with anything, knowledge is power, isn't it? So once you understand, and I think the other thing that is really important, as you know as well, is that it's such a heterogeneous group. Everyone is completely different, and I think that's something that's really important. I think that what I love as part of my role is that I get to support the families with their understanding and how to help at home, but also I'm mainly based in the school now, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You know, my mum, when she was desperately trying to get a diagnosis, it was just getting that person to go, yeah, you know, you're right, you know. And I think we have evolved. You know, I remember being at school and a teacher turned around to my mum and said, you know, he's not autistic, he's just naughty. And there are a lot of myths like that are out there.
And I think with all children, if they can do something, they will. I mean, that's the general rule I always apply. There's not a lazy child or a naughty child. If you can do what's being asked of you, the majority, 99% of children will do that. So yeah, exactly right. And I think that it's increasing, people like teachers' knowledge can be really, really important, can't it?
I think it changes the fabric of that young person's life. You know, if they've got someone around them that really understands them, more importantly, and then the conditions that, you know, give them the reasons as to why they might be behaving a certain way, then a teacher can be really key to unlocking that person and knowing and being able to accept who they are. What do you find are the sort of, with the diagnosis stages, do you think diagnoses are helpful? And when you used to go out for your assessments and try and get to the bottom of a diagnosis, what sort of things are you trying to look out for, you know, to get that diagnosis, and how do people go around trying to get that diagnosis and those assessments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex process now, and I think it varies from area to area. At the school that I'm working at now, we do a peer support group, all the boys with a diagnosis of autism who are autistic come along, and I think we're definitely celebrating that now. And interesting, one of the questions I ask is, you know, how did you find the assessment? Some say boring. And you know, what do you think about having a diagnosis? And I think that we're really moving forward with that, with embracing it. I think that one of the things that can get in the way of people going forward for a diagnosis is this understanding that other people will judge them, or think, I think especially for parents, they're kind of like, you know, they know the symptoms are there and they know what's happening, but putting it all together under a label, there's a big myth, isn't there, about we don't want our child labelled, we don't want them being given an excuse, all of those things. But I've never ever found that to be the case. I've always found it to be really, really helpful. I think one of the other things that comes up a lot is that, you know, if I see someone and you can really see the sensory issues they're going through, you can see the difficulties with rigidity or transitions, you know, maybe the obsessions are a bit more subtle because they might be considered to be normal for a boy, that they're really interested in trains or really interested in fire engines, that's missed. And then when you sort of talk it through with the parents, they'll be like, well, no, there's no way this child can be autistic because they love cuddles, or they're really friendly, or they love their friends. And I think that's one of the biggest myths that really gets in the way of diagnosis, because actually some of the boys that I work with are the most empathetic children I've ever met. And in fact, I was working with someone yesterday and I was like, and he sort of came across and he was really worried because he was worried about his friend, he's worried about, and I thought, gosh, you know, I haven't seen any evidence in a lot of the neurotypical pupils at that age being that concerned and empathetic and worried about other people. So I think that's a really big myth that gets in the way of people going for diagnosis, because autistic people are incredibly empathetic and love having friends and love interacting with people. And my role as a speech therapist is helping with the social communication side, because, you know, even though an autistic person might love that interaction, they might still get it subtly wrong, like taking a turn that's too long, or not asking questions, or talking about their interests. So it's kind of me to fine tune that, or if they're at a lower level, and again I'm talking about sort of IQ, then it might be giving them symbols to communicate with, or it might be using sign language. There are loads of different ways a speech and language therapist can help an autistic child and adult.
I think that's really informative for people, because, you know, I remember growing up, I couldn't talk till I was 6, so I found it very hard. I had to learn Macinton to communicate.
Yeah.
And I remember as well having a speech and language therapist in the end to get me, you know, very steadily to the point where I needed to be. You know, it was just things like learning toe by toe, or you know, just sounding the letters of the alphabet out just gradually. And I always remember seeing other kids just pick it up, and I was sort of sat there thinking, you know, at the same time I was sort of sat there thinking, why can't I figure out? But also, because I had a diagnosis, I knew why. You know, it wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason as to, okay, that might be why I'm not grasping
language in the same way. Yeah, and I think going back to kind of how you have an assessment, obviously I think in the times we're at, I think people watching this would be very well aware that going for a diagnosis can be a long waiting list. So I would, you know, the first port of call is to go to your GP and discuss the problems, and they will refer you on to CAMS. CAMS, I think, and again it will vary very much from area to area, but in our area it's around a two-year waiting list, which is a really long time. And then obviously there's, you could go to see a consultant. For a diagnosis, you do need to be seen by someone who's a paediatrician, and you know, a speech and language therapist might be part of that team, but wouldn't be the person who would diagnose. But again, obviously that can be an expensive process for parents, and it's something to sort of think about. I mean, in an ideal world, I think for me, in an ideal world, you would go and see your GP, and then within the next 6 weeks, you would go and have an assessment, or six weeks to 3 months. That would be the ideal, and I guess that's a big frustration for lots of parents, in the same way as accessing speech and language therapy services. I think COVID has had an effect on that, but the waiting lists have always been long. And I think, yeah, in an ideal situation, you would have these concerns about your child, you would see a GP, and then you would be referred to a specialist, and then that specialist would refer you on to therapy services, because the diagnosis is just the very first part of the puzzle, isn't it? It's the kind of first step, and then it's, you know, how can we help? Because I think that the cluster of symptoms, and maybe you can describe how it was for you when you were growing up, but I think it's that the diagnosis is helpful and it's really good to know, but then it's how can we help, what tools, what strategies, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and that's kind of where we're really moving towards, isn't it? And I remember you saying a long time ago that we don't use the term autistic spectrum disorder anymore because obviously you don't want to be seen as disordered.
Yeah.
But what we do want to do is look at your areas of strength. You know, these are things you're amazing at. Let's bolster those. And how can we support you with the weaknesses? How can we help with the sensory issues? How can we help you with your transitions? And it's about understanding all the little bits of the puzzle and making sure that you can go out into the world and be the best person you can, which is the ideal, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think the average waiting time now is 4 years just to get a diagnosis. It's just
which is it's a whole of a child's development. It could be the whole of their middle school, or or the whole of their preschool, and it's a really long time, and that's, I think, such a tragedy, really.
And we know early intervention is really key to get the help and support. And I think when I was growing up, even though I had the diagnosis, because there wasn't things like the Autism Act, or people were still not fully in the know of how to deal with these conditions, that a lot of stuff still got missed, and a lot of people got missed throughout the system. But it just amazes me still to this day, about 50% of autistic kids are still getting kicked out of school. Yeah,
and that's that's a real tragedy.
It's an absolute just number that shouldn't exist, but it sort of leads to my next question for you, which was, what sort of was it like for you growing up, and do you remember about the awareness around conditions and everything, and more importantly, what made you want to become a speech and language therapist?
Well, I think that sort of growing up, I probably knew very little about autism, and I think that probably the only people I did identify as autistic would be the people who were very, very obvious, and I think that within my school we didn't have anyone who's autistic. Looking back, we probably did, and I think that actually now we all know someone, and I think that what I'm seeing a lot is a lot of adults who are having a diagnosis. I mean, you see a lot in LinkedIn, a lot in the workplace, don't you? People who are like, oh, hang on a minute, I've had ADHD all my life, hang on a minute, I've had autism all my life, and actually it's like and actually it's, for those people who are adults, it's kind of like a light bulb moment, and actually they've kind of generally gone to a workplace that works for them, fits for them, and they've kind of worked their way around it, and then I think again, if you're an adult who thinks, actually now I can see some traits in my child, these are some traits with me, I think I would embrace going for that diagnosis as well. I think that there's a lot of people who say to me, oh, do you think people are being overdiagnosed now? No, I just think that we didn't understand autism before, and I think that we understand it so much more. Autism in girls is a really big area, isn't it, where you've got that girl who's kind of cope and mask, go all the way through the school system, they've never had any friends, they keep getting it wrong. I mean, getting it wrong in terms of normal social communication, that they're not making the friends and they can't understand why. And that's a kind of big growth development in terms of our knowledge and understanding, isn't it? I wanted to be a speech and language therapist. I did a psychology degree, that was my first degree at Cardiff University. And I saw various psychologists doing lots of assessments and things, and I know that psychologists do lots of therapy, but then I went on a placement with a speech therapist, and she was very hands-on, lots and lots of input, and actually I thought, gosh, I don't want to be assessing children and then passing them on to someone else. I want to be the person who's doing the helping, doing the supporting. I want to be the person who's working with the families and kind of seeing the progress over a period of time. I don't want to kind of see someone at a full monthly review. I want to kind of be hands-in, doing the work, and I mean, I've been doing it for 22 years. It's very rewarding. I've been there for people's first words, first symbol exchange, first here we're watching people who are going off to college, and actually the change in family life can be a really big one for me when you're when you're the person who's supporting the family, and actually they've gone from having every night's a nightmare to put the routines in place, put the structure in place, problem solve the sensory issues, and you kind of can transform a family's life. So I mean, I really love and enjoy my job, and I love the kids I work with. That's the main thing. I kind of every single one of them, they're a very big part in my life really, because I'm here 5 days a week, and there's not a dull moment, and I just love working with all of them.
I think it's so true, because the thing is, it's something, especially getting older, that I've realised is I spend more time with the people here than I probably do with my family. and those kids that you're supporting and you're having a major impact on their lives, you know, you're spending more time with them than your family.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you know, and this is like, for me, I'm one of the guests on this year's series is my old TA, Miss Anderson.
Oh, lovely.
And I only had her for 2 years, but she changed my life.
Oh, sure.
You know, to the point where 16 and 8 years later, I had to get back in touch.
Yeah.
Because, and what I found out was, and it'd be an interesting question for you, is she had no experience in autism before that.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that people are aware of autism and they have maybe basic training. But I always say to people, you know, you could read 30 books on autism, but if you can't understand how it impacts the individual, then you might as well throw them out the window. So I suppose I just wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, do you think it's essential that you know, teachers absolutely need to have full-on autistic training, or do you feel that's sort of limiting people being able to get those jobs and support autistic people?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It's the person, not the knowledge sometimes. It's the person that can get into that person's head and go, right, okay, I can see assembly is always a nightmare for you. Let's bypass assembly. It's about problem solving. It's not about necessarily understanding autism. It's like, okay, you know, maths is really amazing. We don't need to support you with that. But actually, we can see that you need a bit more support on the playground. It's just using logic a lot of the time, kind of thinking about, okay, we know that the noisy environment's going to be really difficult for you. How do we bypass that, or how do we integrate it so we have less time? And I think that's what I was going to say about the diagnosis process, because there might be people here who are like really frustrated and they're not having a diagnosis, they can't afford to pay for it, they know they're going to wait. Don't let that get in your way. You know, just understand your child. What are they finding easy? What are they finding difficult? What could you get them more support with? Is it that their clothes are really uncomfortable? Can you communicate with your child's school, and can they find a way of bypassing that? Is your child really struggling with fussy eating? There are loads of really good Instagram posts about picky eaters with great advice on. Internet is an amazing resource, and we can use it for all sorts of things, and we can use it for loads of therapy ideas. If your child is only using one word, what your goal might be, how can we expand that to 2 words? Your child might only be communicating with one person. How can you think about integrating that into other things? How can you use your child's interest? It used to be really, when I started in therapy, people were trying to get people away from their obsessions. Don't get them away. Whereas now it's just, we use them. If your child loves fire engines, use that for counting. If you use it for expressive language, you know, think about, is it red, is it long, is it big, is it fast, use their interests and kind of integrate that into whatever you're doing. So don't be disheartened, just think, okay, this is where they are now. This is the things they're really good at. This is the things they're not so good at. How can we support them as a family or a school team, or if you're older, out in the workplace, how can you think about, this is the thing I'm really good at. I'm really good at data. I'm really good at numbers. I'm finding team meetings a bit tricky. How can you solve that with your manager? How can you think about making that easier for you? Just do it step by step and think, where are the deficits? What can I do to help myself with those?
Absolutely. I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask as well, because I did an interview last year with Laura Ferris, and we were discussing the diagnosis problem, you know, the waiting list and how long it can take. And one of the things that she came up with, which I thought was actually a really good idea, was how beneficial it would be if people like yourself, special educational need, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, you know, within schools, could have the ability to diagnose.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, like I said before, when I was part of the multidisciplinary team, that would be me, OT, a nursery nurse, and the paediatrician, and we would do all our separate parts of the assessment. We'd come together, and then the consultant did an ADOS, which is part of the diagnostic process, and then we put all that information together and give it as a team, because what people might not understand is, why is a speech and language therapist involved? And often I'll have someone say, oh no, it's fine, his speech is fine, you don't need to get involved, and they think it's just around speech sounds. But actually a big part of my role is around social communication, so facial expressions, body language, conversation, you know, conversation is incredibly complex. So while we're chatting here, you're looking at me, you're nodding, you're showing me you're interested, you're not talking over me. And the time difference between you talking and me talking in a normal conversation is something like 0.000 between me stopping talking and you starting talking. And then within that, there's semantics, what am I talking about? Then there's vocabulary. And then, you know, when you get into schools, there are things like maths, there are things that are like reading for meaning, inference, all of those things. So language is incredibly complex, social communication is incredibly complex, and actually it's a big part of the autism. So the occupational therapist would help with the sensory needs, I would help with the social communication and language. You might have a paediatrician who's doing reviews for things like your sleep, or they might be helping, you might have a dual diagnosis of ADHD, and then they would be helping with medication if that's the route you went down. So I think that helping a child or an autistic adult is definitely best if you can do it as a team. That's what the clinical guidelines are nice, is always multidisciplinary team. But for some people who haven't come across a speech therapist and think, well, you know, what is my role? That's what I would be helping with.
Yeah.
Also for eating, fussy eating was a big thing.
Mine was, eating was always a big thing. Clothes was always a big thing. Going off on tangents about my thing that I was really interested in. Couldn't really understand why no one was interested in wrestling, and couldn't really pick up on that environment around me. You know, people thinking, when's he going to sort of shut up and move on, you know? And you're right, you know, it is those things: eye contact, understanding sarcasm, you know, jokes, when to say something, you know, when not to.
Yeah, that's really subtle. So a lot of work on think it or say it. So you might have someone who'd be like, I really don't like this, it's really boring, and someone will say, oh, that's really rude. But actually it's a fact, they're finding it boring, you know, and that you get that a lot. Well, I don't really like you, you're not my friend. And someone will say, oh, he's really unkind. No, he's just saying he doesn't like you and he's not your friend. But actually working out how that we kind of tell a lot of white lies in normal social communication, and that can be really difficult for someone who is autistic.
Yeah, because a lot of the people I've met, I think over time as they grow up, especially when they've got a diagnosis, they know it's something that they need to work on.
Yeah.
But even when I've been socialising with someone, I've sort of heard something, or sometimes I've said something and thought, oh, why did I say that?
Yeah, because we all get it wrong, don't we? Social communication, we all get it wrong all the time. You know, I think frequently you'll have someone who, you know, you meet at a dinner or something and you think, you know, gosh, you haven't asked me a single question. It's not just related to autistic adults, it's all of us. We all have our own quirks and our own things that we're good at, our own strengths and weaknesses, don't we, in terms of like having a good chat or not. Yeah, but it's definitely a really large area. And for children who I also worked at a special school for 16 years. And for the children there, they also had severe learning difficulties or moderate learning difficulties. Obviously that's an element which is sort of a separate part, but can have a really big impact. And so for those children it might be more around just being able to communicate using a symbol system, or it might be communicating. Actually now people are using assisted technology a lot, so it might be that they're using a voice evoker, which is voice output communication system. And then, you know, I've had a few children who have been very dyspraxic, and that means they find it very difficult to make the speech sounds. And there was one boy who we worked with who we thought was very, very dyspraxic, and we worked through that. And actually, he was told he would never speak, and we did teach him to speak, which was a really big moment for his mum. And then actually, we picked it apart, and we had all these amazing systems in place, and realised actually it was the autism. He didn't want to communicate about certain things, and that's why he wasn't communicating. Down syndrome, you can often have a dual diagnosis with Down syndrome. That's a lot more common than people think. And as you know, ADHD, because I think you've had a diagnosis of OCD, ADHD and autism.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed OCD, ADHD, autism and epileptic. So which sort of leads on to another question, which was a lot through my life, you know, I found out when I went on ADHD medicine, I developed Tourette's, so I had to come off meds. And then when I went on some other meds, there's one of the things that the doctors reckoned was it could have caused my epilepsy, because it could lower the threshold. And through a lot of research, I found out that ADHD medicines can just be as harmful and as addictive as some Schedule 2 drugs. So it's up there with, you know, like your cocaine and your heroin sort of drugs. So So I just wanted to get your thoughts on medicine, because I know that they can work, and I know that for some people it can change their lives. And one thing I always recommend is, if you're going to do that route, very low dosage, more cognitive behavioural therapy.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to get your thoughts, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think with autism specifically, I think that medication might be more around sort of melatonin, so helping with sleep, and I think that can be really helpful. I think especially if you're a family who has got a child who's awake till 2 in the morning and then up at 4 in the morning as a family, and for that child, and we all know when we're tired, behaviour goes out of the window, or my baby definitely does. I mean, if I'm tired, hungry, and I think sometimes with families, I just get down to that level, because sometimes we just forget the basics. That's the most important. If we can have a child who's well rested, eating the right amount of food, and isn't kind of too overwhelmed by their environment, we've got a completely different child on our hands. So if we can kind of make sure they know what's happening, when it's happening, they've got a full tummy, they've had a fairly decent night's sleep, the behaviour you'll get from that child will be completely different to a child who's really hungry, hasn't eaten any of the right things. And again, there is no judgment around children with autism and food, because I know that there are some of the boys I work with would eat one specific sausage roll, one specific, and that is, it's really difficult for the family, really difficult for them, but that's just all they'll tolerate. So you kind of have to accept that, and if they're having enough of that food, that's fine. But I think that if you can make sure that if the child hasn't slept, they're really hungry, they're cranky, we all know what it's like, their behaviour will completely go out the window, and then therapy will go out the window. So kind of put all those things in place. So I think things like melatonin can be very helpful if they can help with sleep. I mean, I guess medication for autism is more around medication for ADHD, as you're saying. And I think that obviously it's much more of a medical role than mine. I have seen some children who it's kind of almost like transformed their ability to sit and listen and take part in school life. But obviously I'm not as aware of the kind of side effects, and I think it's especially, I guess, when we're starting medication for some children quite early, something that parents need to kind of give careful consideration to as well.
Yeah, and I think times have probably changed, because I remember
medications have probably changed too, maybe.
Yeah, and their thought process behind it, because I remember, going on quite a high dosage and then not really possibly thinking, actually, how much are we giving this person?
Whereas I think now, I know that some of the children that we work with, they kind of start on the lower dose. There's lots of reviews and kind of making sure that it's working for them as well, because I think it can have a sort of settling down period, can't it? And all those things. Yeah, so I think that it can, like I say, can transform some children's lives in terms of, because if you can't ever sit and listen and focus, and you're always kind of moving around, it can, I think the consultant we work with says it's like putting on a pair of glasses and you can suddenly see better. But I think obviously with all medication, as we know, you have to be aware of side effects and things.
It's weighing it up, isn't it? Because you're right, you don't want the kids sat in the class not being able to focus.
Not being able to take on board what's happening. Yeah, exactly, because it's all about kind of whatever goes in. If it's not going in, then you're not going to be learning. So yeah, I think and I think that the really amazing thing for me is that I can, because I work all the way through the school, I can see the transformation. And we've had children who've come in here from a different school perhaps and haven't had the support in place, and they've been under the table and they've been stimming with iPads and they've been unable to focus, and you kind of see them transform and go through the school and actually sitting, listening, understanding, forming good social relationships, being supported at home, help with nutrition, and it just makes such a big difference. And you can see that going forward it will continue to make a difference. So it's really, really nice.
I mean, just one of the points I wanted just to ask as well, because I'm just generally interested, was around girls and autism. And obviously we know, I hate the statistic that boys are 2 times more likely to be autistic. No, they're 2 more times likely to be diagnosed, because the myth of girls couldn't get autism. We know that's not true. We know that girls can be autistic, and there's probably many girls out there that are autistic that don't know, because a lot of people have been unfortunately under the illusion for many years that it just couldn't happen. But I don't know, I just wanted to get your thoughts on why do you think that it is that girls aren't getting as diagnosed as much.
Yeah, I mean, when I worked in the special school, the children that we had, the girls who we had who were autistic were often the very severely autistic children. So they'd be often have really high OCD traits, might be non-verbal. So I think that the children, the girls with autism who were being diagnosed, they're one in two, were the ones who were kind of very clearly autistic. And I think that what the science is showing now is that girls are much better at copying and imitating, so that they would sit in a class and watch and copy. So even if they didn't understand the social interaction, they would just be able to copy it. And then I think the other sort of research is showing that if they did have an obsession, it might be something like obsessed over Boyzone or something, or My Little Pony or Cinderella, or something that seems kind of developmentally appropriate. And I think that again, I think that because the kind of need to conform is a bit more within girls, and perhaps their language levels are also a bit higher, so the children who aren't being diagnosed are kind of still fitting in language-wise, although their language might seem a bit idiosyncratic. And what really is happening is that mental health awareness is getting better, and I think a lot of the children who had girls with autism were being channeled down a different mental health route, so they were being seen for anxiety or eating disorders or those sorts of things, whereas actually now we know a bit more, the eating disorder was related to their sensory issues, or their anxiety and OCD was related to their autism, but those things were missed. So they were kind of channel or depression because of lack of friends and social interaction. They were depressed, but it was because they were really having trouble with friendships and relationships and emotional regulation. So I think that typically what used to happen is they used to get channeled down a whole different route, and now we're kind of picking it apart. And I think that the sort of obsessive side is less, and that's something that's often quite a key part of picking up autism in boys. It can be quite obvious and prevalent, but I think that's the key reason, and we're kind of now increasing our understanding. I think also because the girls were masking and trying to fit in, and we just put it down to, they're having a meltdown when things went wrong, or they're just being hormonal, because it's really at teenage level when it becomes social communication becomes so complex. Once you become a teenager, there's so much going on that the breakdowns just happen a lot more, whereas before it's just running around. They can copy that. They can't copy someone subtly leaving you out in a group, or looking at the others when you're talking. All those things that suddenly start coming into play a sort of much bigger factor, and that's when it sort of starts to go wrong for those girls, unfortunately. Yeah.
Wow, it's really interesting. I suppose my last question, bit of a two-part question, would be, out of all the environments that you've worked in, schools, whether that's mainstream, special educational needs schools, what do you think it is that mainstream schools can do better? What do you find has been the best place for pupils with special educational needs? And also the last question really would be, if anyone could take a message out of today's session, what would be the core message for you for people to take away?
I mean, I think with the school placement, I think schools have kind of gone in all sorts of different directions over the 20 years I've worked. So it used to be that everyone was placed in a mainstream setting, and that was the best thing. But actually, I think that, and obviously, I know that you went to a unit. If you're lucky enough to have an autistic unit attached to school, I think that's great. I think you have to look at your child and work out where they are. I worked in a special school where the classes were really small sizes. The classroom was set up perfectly for those children. The communication was there. They had OT, they had physio, they had all of the resources. And I think that it used to be, everyone has to go to mainstream. I don't agree with that. I think that actually you have to look at your child. Where are they in terms of their learning? Do you want your child to be in a class where everyone's learning things at a 2 or 3 year level above you and you're sat with your TA? Probably not. I don't think that's the best thing for your child, and I don't think you can develop in the best way. I think that mainstream is absolutely a great place for lots and lots of autistic children. It's very much IQ led and ability led, and I think that what the key thing is to make sure that you've got the support in place, which is obviously again difficult, but making sure that you've got the people who can help you, or that you're fighting for your rights to kind of make sure that you've got the support you need for your child, and knowing all of those things. So I don't think there definitely isn't a one size fits all. I loved working at the special school. I love the fact that I worked as part of a team. I love the small classes. I'm loving working at a prep school with really, children who have got really high IQ. Because as we know, it's like such a wide range of autistic children, and adults are exactly the same as neurotypical children and adults. There's a complete range, and I don't think there is I think the only good placement is a placement where their child is happy. That's the right placement, where you're happy and your child is happy. And I think, so your last question, what would be my takeaway? My takeaway would just be, and I've always said this, assessment and a diagnosis is completely valuable, but your child or you're you. And I think that a label and not a label, your child or you, if you're an adult listening, you're wonderful, and what you have to just think is, what are my things that I'm brilliant at? Okay, let's focus on those and let's run with those. What things do I need a bit of help with? You think about your environment, think about what things help you problem solve it. Don't kind of panic if you can't get access to services, because as a parent, you are often the best therapist. You often know your child the best, and I think that nowadays we've got so much knowledge out there, and I'm always reading, I'm always researching, I'm always going on courses. I've been on about 30 courses related to autism. I always learn something new. I always take something away and think, oh right, okay, an energy bank. That's like, I read on a really good Tony Outward course recently. We're all learning. And I think knowledge is power. I think that's the key thing I take away. Knowledge is power. The more you understand, the better you can help yourself or your child. And
honestly, I think, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting, and I think yeah, you're right. No size fits everyone. When you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and I think the main thing is getting to know that individual, and then you can support them in the best way that you can. And no, thank you ever so much for agreeing to come on,
my pleasure.
And it's been brilliant. So thank you.
Great, right, thanks Max.